to the town hall. This is, as you know, we've been doing clustering of town halls in 8 locations throughout Saanich-Gulf Islands twice a year. In this cycle, we decided we needed 9 because in the southern part of the peninsula, in Saanich, we were getting such, in September, the room was so full and people had to be sent away, so we organized 2 in the Saanich area this time around, and they both were overflowing, so that was a good sign. Yes, that was a great sign. The purpose of a town hall meeting is not for you to hear me speak. The purpose of the town hall meeting is for me to give my employers a report on what I've been doing since I last reported, which is to say I'll tell you what I've been up to in Parliament and elsewhere. And then for you to tell me what issues are on your mind and ask me what I make of whatever event or issue is most concerning you. I love these opportunities. It means when I go back to Ottawa, not only do I have more petitions signed, and someone was just asking me, Chris was asking, how many names I need on petitions before I can present them. I need 25 names, actually 24. And every member of Parliament has the opportunity to present petitions in a slot that occurs once a day when the House is open. And for those who sign petitions online, they're very effective for showing mass public support, but under the current rules of the House of Commons, they can't be presented to Parliament, which is why on my website, if you didn't sign a petition today that you wanted to, or you want to see a petition created that's currently not here, you can work with us to have us do that, or you can download petitions from the website and take the paper copy around to get friends to sign it. And if you have friends in other parts of the country and you'd like to see more petitions sent to, say, Conservative members of Parliament, asking them not to ratify the Canada-China Investment Treaty or to say no to the Anchorage Pipeline project, you can encourage friends and relatives across Canada to also download the petitions from my website and send them to their MP. Because parliamentary tradition is that a member of Parliament should, there's no absolute rule, but a member of Parliament is expected to present a petition from their constituents whether they agree with it or not. It's a good way of sensitizing other members of Parliament to key issues. So, not only do I leave after town hall meetings with more names on petitions, I also have the benefit of standing in the House of Commons and being able to say, I held town hall meetings throughout my riding, and my constituents want to know whatever, or my constituents want you to know whatever. So it's really, I love these opportunities. Now, since the last town hall meeting, which was reporting to you on the late winter spring session of Parliament, we had the fall session. And as you know, it was truncated by a prorogation. So whereas I was expecting to be back in Parliament in about mid-September, Stephen Harper prorogued till mid-October. Now, this meant that I suddenly had some open dates on my calendar. There were a bunch of weekdays that weren't filled. And so we decided, since I was in the midst of the sort of town hall meetings throughout the riding, we did a town hall meeting tour of Canada to talk about the threats to democracy. So I managed in the period of prorogation to get to 17 communities in 7 provinces in the Yukon, across Canada, with tremendous public response to just talking about and opening up the opportunity for Canadians to talk about the threats to Canadian democracy. Parliament resumed right after Thanksgiving with a speech from the throne. The main news item out of the speech from the throne, unless you consider that we're now going to start celebrating the beginning of the First World War with numerous ceremonies, but the real hard news was that the Harper administration had achieved an agreement in principle with the European Union for
for the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, which many of you will know of as CETA. And that agreement has yet to be tabled. We don't have the text, but that was the announcement in the speech from the throne. The next thing that happened, at least in terms of my experience, was an unwelcome blow to my rights as a member of Parliament. Some of you will remember that I reported quite cheerfully, one of the last times I saw you, that Peter Van Loan, the Conservative House Leader, had attempted to get the Speaker to throw my amendments out at report stage. Now, as you may know, I've been using the rules of Parliament as assiduously and creatively as I can, and I've discovered a rule that no other MP had ever used, which gave me the right to present my amendments to every piece of government legislation at report stage of the bill. That's how I had 400 amendments to the horrible omnibus budget bill of 2012, Bill C-38. There were 400 amendments, and that's why we had that marathon 24 hours of voting. Well, I didn't present 400 amendments to Bill C-38 just to have 24 hours of voting nonstop. I did it in hopes of forcing a compromise and at least getting some of the environmental legislation that was being devastated in that horrible bill to be withdrawn. In any case, whether I succeeded in doing anything or not, it was clear that the Conservatives didn't like what I'd done, so they wanted to change the rules, and what they suggested to the Speaker back in November of 2012 was that all of my amendments should be grouped, and that the Speaker should pull one sample amendment and put it to a vote, and that if it failed, none of my amendments should be voted on. Now, given a Conservative majority in the House, it's a done deal that all opposition amendments are going to fail, whether they're mine or someone else's. The Speaker's ruling on that was really encouraging to me. The Speaker ruled in late 2013 that in fact, Canadian Parliament is a democracy, and that the function of members of Parliament was to put forward amendments to bills, and that when a member such as myself in a party that has fewer than 12 members of Parliament is not entitled to sit on parliamentary committees, therefore, the only way I could put forward my amendments was to do what I've been doing, bring them forward at report stage. So I thought I'd won one. I was very happy. I should have paid more attention to the weasel words, as my law profs used to call them, about as long as she doesn't have a right to bring forward amendments at committee, she must have a right to bring them forward at report stage. So lo and behold, after the speech from the throne this fall, spontaneously 20 different parliamentary committees had 20 different Conservative members of Parliament table motions they claimed to be their own, but which were identical each to the other, and said 48 hours from when our committee comes to clause-by-clause review of any piece of legislation, members of Parliament in parties fewer than 12 members, which is basically the Green Party and the Bloc Québécois, and any independent members of Parliament, will be invited to the committee. And their amendments will be deemed to have been moved, and then they'll be voted on in committee. So, against all odds, this has actually increased my workload. It passed in every committee. Sometimes they went in camera to pass these motions, so that there were no reporting of the event. But I was very grateful. I had the support of the New Democrats and the Liberals in the committees to try to stop these motions, but they all passed. So what it's meant since I last saw you is that I still present and prepare amendments on every piece of legislation, unless it's good legislation and doesn't require amendment. But in general, that means I'm preparing amendments on every piece of legislation. And now I have to take them to each committee. And then I'm allowed to speak to my amendment, 60 seconds per amendment, and then my amendments go through something I now refer to as their ritual slaughter. And then I'm not allowed to do amendments at report stage. So this has been pretty devastating. It's also more difficult because I have to run from committee to committee. Sometimes they're meeting at around the same time. We've
try. The other we had a bit of a success this fall in that I negotiated before the early adjournment in June. In exchange for my permission to adjourn early, I wrestled from the Conservatives the right for all the members in this category I just described, parties under 12 and independents. I ended up negotiating for us as a group to have the right to participate in a review of something called the Board of Internal Economy. The Board of Internal Economy is the bunch of people who meet completely in private. It's like a star chamber, conservatives, liberals, and New Democrats, and they decide how much reporting there has to be of member expenses, how much transparency, if somebody's committed an offense, how much do we want to talk about that. Essentially, every party really is worried that even if they've got a chance to go after one of the others for malfeasance, there's always the risk that one of their own members has done something, so it's better to just cover the whole thing up. So the Board of Internal Economy is terribly secretive, and members of Parliament who aren't in one of the big parties have no access to that organization. So I was pleased that we managed to participate, and it was interesting, because I basically became the coordinator, kind of bizarre, for the Bloc Québécois, former Conservative Brent Rathgaber, who's a wonderful guy, former Bloc Québécois Maria Morani, former NDPer, then independent Bruce Heyer, who's since become Green, and we had to negotiate a report, a dissenting report to the majority, that raised for the first time issues of how does the Board of Internal Economy deal with labor issues within Parliament. The treatment of workers in the House of Commons is terrible. I won't go into details. The ecological footprint of the House of Commons, terrible. So we were able to bring these issues forward, so I felt good about that. The other things, of course, were the legislation itself through the fall. We had a second 2013 budget omnibus bill, Bill C4. It was, of course, these bills are omnibus, meaning there's everything in them, so there's no one theme. But if there was a theme to C4, it was an attack on collective bargaining rights for civil servants, and taking away under the Canada Labour Code, at least weakening the right to refuse unsafe work. So the word dangerous was changed, the definition of dangerous was changed to mean, more life-threatening and take out the threat of chronic illness and so on. There's also a change that was actually mentioned in the budget. I mean, a lot of the things in these omnibus budget bills were never mentioned in the budget. This next one was mentioned in the budget, which was the elimination of the Canadian International Development Agency. So CEDA has been officially eliminated, and now what we have is the functions of development assistance are now within Foreign Affairs Department. I'm noticing since I started talking, a whole bunch more people came in. Anybody sitting near an empty seat, could you put your hand up so people can find a spot to sit? I don't want anyone stuck standing, because I know there are still some seats. Make yourselves at home. I'll try not to. Good, good, good. Keep coming and find a good spot. There's seats every which way through here. Because we can always set up more chairs. Oh, and all you guys up there. Hello. Okay, there's seats down here if you want them. And if anybody needs more chairs, let me know. This is the media corner up there, I can sit down. Okay, so the other things that happens, the other thing in Bill C4 that I should mention, there was a lot in C4. There was a retroactive attempt to change the laws that apply to the appointment of a member of the Supreme Court bench representing Quebec. As you know, you may know, this is now before the Supreme Court of Canada that Mr. Justice Marc Nadon is being challenged as an appointee for Quebec by the government of Quebec. They've attempted in C4 to change the law retroactively in relation to Supreme Court appointments from Quebec. Another one to which I brought forward amendments is the sale of a big chunk of land in British Columbia. You may know that Jim Flaherty, Minister of Finance, is committed to eliminating the deficit before the next election, which is fine with me. The deficit was created largely for a stimulus package
We could have had surpluses to handle the stimulus package if not for the tax cutting that Harper did before 2008, but that's another matter. What they're doing a lot towards deficit elimination is the sale of Canadian assets. Now, most of the sale of Canadian assets doesn't have to come to the House of Commons first for review. So you may have seen we sold off Canada Place, the home for Canada in downtown London in the UK, which had been the residence for our ambassadors. And so they've been selling embassies, selling rare Canadian gold coins. But this particular sale is a big chunk of land in southeastern British Columbia, known as the Dominion Coal Lands. It's in the area of ecologically sensitive, important areas in the vicinity of the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. There's been some concern from UNESCO over the sale of these lands. The reason it had to come to Parliament for a vote, and the reason it was lumped in the omnibus budget bill, is that it goes way back, I mean like really way back to the building of the railway, and a piece of legislation called the Crow's Nest Pass Act. And they had to amend the Crow's Nest Pass Act to sell this land to, for coal mining. So I think it's 20,000 hectares, maybe 40,000 hectares. It's been a while since I was arguing C4, but it didn't get much attention because when everything's lumped together, we don't really get to hear much about it. There was also legislation on First Nations elections, legislation on copyright, and amendments on all of these. And one time, this is one of the first times, for me, the first time, working on a piece of conservative legislation that we succeeded as a solid opposition to have some changes made was in a bill to implement the Cluster Munitions Treaty. Canada signed a treaty to ban cluster munitions some years ago. We have not yet ratified, so the legislation to bring in the Cluster Munitions Treaty said the things you would expect, that Canada's armed forces will no longer use, transport, purchase, develop, etc., any cluster munitions. But it also said, but when Canada is in a cooperative, collaborative theater of war with an allied nation that is not a party to the Cluster Munitions Convention, then Canadian armed forces can use, distribute, etc., cluster munitions. The United States is not a party to the Cluster Munitions Convention. So the compromise that we got, which is better than nothing, I mean, we put forward, and I have to say, Paul Doerr of the NDP was in the committee with me. We made some real progress, and I was very pleased and surprised that when we brought forward amendments about the Cluster Munitions Convention, that we should not have Canadian armed forces using, we should not conspire to use them, we should not be in the same room when the U.S. wants to use cluster munitions. In any case, the Conservatives adjourned for a whole week and came back. It's not perfect by any means, but at least Canadian armed forces are no longer given dispensation to use cluster munitions if we're in a theater of war with the U.S. I could go into more detail, but I'll stop there. The other really exciting piece of legislation about which I'm very encouraged that was brought forward right before the adjournment in December is a private member's bill for democratic reform to reduce the powers of the Prime Minister's office, reduce the power of leaders. It's great. It's a private member's bill brought forward by a Conservative member of Parliament from outside Toronto. His name is Michael Chong. He's the member of Parliament for Wellington, Halton Hills. And I'm a co-sponsor of his bill. I couldn't be more thrilled with what he's trying to do, and we'll see what happens. I could go into more detail if you're interested in question and answer. I want to move on quickly to say that the other thing I did since I last saw you was to go to the climate negotiations in Warsaw, Poland. This was the 19th conference of the parties. You'll recall that the Copenhagen negotiations, which were COP15, were a complete disaster. Since then, very few climate activists have put much effort into the multilateral process because people were so discouraged. And I believe we need to put effort back into the multilateral process.
Because while we're working locally and provincially and municipally and every way we can, we also need a global treaty. And the new deadline for the next conference of parties will be in Peru. To tell you how Warsaw was is to say it was about the worst week I've ever had, and I've had bad weeks. It was a very unpleasant time. It wasn't as bad as Copenhagen. Nothing would be as bad as Copenhagen, but it was very discouraging. As a Canadian member of Parliament, and this is unique in the world, Canada is unique in the world in not allowing opposition members of Parliament on the government delegation. Every other country in the world puts opposition members of Parliament on the government delegation if that's where they want to be. One of my friends, a member of Parliament from New Zealand, a very prominent Green Party, strong climate critic, didn't want to be on the New Zealand delegation because he disapproves of what the New Zealand government is doing these days. That's the option. I keep pushing because I think it's outrageous that they won't take anyone on the government delegation unless they are sort of within the conservative fold. It's kind of like the group that Harper is now taking to Israel. So you look at this and think, what on earth? Anyway, I went to Durban, to the climate negotiations in South Africa 2 years ago, and was accepted as a member of a different government delegation. So I said, why would I want to be with a different government? Why would I want to be with a Canadian government? Reality is that when you go to an international climate negotiation or any other kind of multilateral UN process, you can get credentials as a non-government person easily. Well, not easily, but you can go as a representative. In my case, I could go as part of the Global Greens Network. I could get to all the plenary discussions. I could go to all the side events. But the back rooms where the real deals are done, you're only allowed in those rooms if you have a bright pink badge, which means you're with the government, and across the pink band is the name of your country. So in Durban, 2 years ago, I knew before I got there that I had been accepted to be a member of the delegation of Papua New Guinea. So I went to Durban as Papua New Guinea. Which is great because they're a very activist country with a lot of strong climate presence in these meetings. But Papua New Guinea couldn't take me this time, and neither could Tuvalu. I asked around. I know some of the delegation leaders. So I got to Warsaw fully expecting to spend the week as an NGO, only able to get to some rooms. So I made a small or large, depending on how you look at it, tactical error in that I was so moved by the opening speech from the lead negotiator from the Philippines, Elizaebth, who said, because of Typhoon Haiyan and the devastation and the loss of life because of climate change, and he said this himself, this is because of climate change, this devastation of Typhoon Haiyan, he said, I'm going to, as a commitment to remind people of the urgency, I'm going to fast for this entire negotiation. So I thought, right, me too. So I announced to the Canadian media, I will be fasting in solidarity with Elizaebth. Quite a few other delegation members from around the world were fasting in solidarity with Elizaebth. The only reason this was a tactical mistake was that when I got to Warsaw and I got my credentials as Global Greens Network, no pink badge for me, I was approached by the head of the delegation from Afghanistan, and they needed help. They had a PhD climate expert from a university in Australia who was working with them, and he told them he'd heard that I was available. And so I ended up, I know it's so weird, it's so weird. I ended up, and he was a lovely man, Dr. Malakir. He met me, he said, come with me, and he led me to the credentialing area, and I turned in my Global Greens badge and became a member of the delegation of the government of Afghanistan. And I worked so hard for them, and I was hungry, you know, because I was fasting. I fasted for longer, and I worked harder, but I've never worked that hard while fasting, and that's where I think I made a really big mistake. But anyway, it was So Kim's giving me
accomplished, a lot less than what's accomplished and should have been. I will, if you have a question, that Canada was, as usual, terrible. I was the only member of Parliament from Canada there, except for the Minister of Environment, Elizaebth. I never did see her. I saw her speech at the front of plenary. By the time I reached her, she'd gone. I ran into some Quebec government folks, and they said, well, we'll see you tonight at the reception. And I said, what reception? And they said, oh, the one at the Canadian Embassy for all Canadians at this conference. I wasn't going to crash the reception, so I didn't go. Anyways, but there are other bits of climate news. After the adjournment in the sort of mid-December, two other important things, well, more than two important things happened. The morning after we adjourned was when the horrible news came out from Canada Post about discontinuing the delivery of mail in urban areas across Canada. Substantial cutbacks. I know there's a lot of people concerned on Salt Spring about changes in the Ganges Post Office. We can talk about that later. The other big thing that occurred after adjournment, of course, was the report of the Joint Review Panel of the National Energy Board in relation to the Enbridge project. Very, very weak and poorly reasoned, lacking in any kind of rigor. I mean, I think we all knew where the National Energy Board would come down, because the National Energy Board has, in its history, never said no to a pipeline. But this was a particularly thin and basically the assumption that underlies the whole report is we know this is going to be in Canada's interest, so therefore the loss of habitat, loss of grizzly bears, loss of whales, it doesn't matter because we have to do it. But there's no analysis that says this is in Canada's economic interest. So it's a very deep report, and several groups are now taking it to court. And then, of course, we also found out that over the summer, which we hadn't known, DFO has reopened the application for new fish farms, and we only found that out because they finally informed First Nations. They still have not, the Harper administration has still provided no response after more than a year to the recommendations of the Cullen Commission on the missing Fraser River salmon. And the other thing that, of course, that is a real low for the year, I have some blogs, copies of my blog of the highs and lows of 2013 in the back of the room. One of the real lows being our loss of libraries, particularly science libraries, the loss of collections such as those of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Quite scandalous. So I've taken longer than I meant to, but that's a brief review of what happened since I last saw you. Looking forward to 2014, Parliament resumes on Monday. I have first question period on Monday. I will be for the first time joined by a colleague who's been sitting next to me for the last 2 years, but has been sitting as an independent. So I will now have the help of a second Green Party MP sitting with me, and I think that will help my efforts on a lot of these issues. But I'll be looking forward to trying to get my private member's bill for a national Lyme disease strategy passed. It will come up for second reading probably in February, and I'm feeling cautiously optimistic about that. And of course, going back to the other really exciting news of a real effort from a lot of people in the backbenches who want to see Michael Chong's bill passed, and I'm feeling really excited about the potential to get that bill passed. So that's my report. I'm sorry about as long as I did. I see that more people have come in since I last asked. Are there still empty chairs in the room that people can identify by putting your hand up? So if you just came in and you want to find a chair, there are still spots where there are chairs. And I don't want you to be uncomfortable. I hope I'm handling this microphone okay and that listening to this isn't too difficult. Okay, it's good? Okay, good. So thank you all for coming tonight. And I think the first question, now I'm just looking around. Now at this point we have to watch for questions as opposed to people with empty chairs next to them. Okay, we've moved the format. Okay.